Good morning, everybody. Welcome to all of the cybersecurity curious individuals out there. This is our Cybersecurity Foundations webinar. My name is Jeremy Johnson. I'm a virtual CIO, or Virtual Chief Information Officer at Convergence Networks. Joining me today, moving on slides there. Joining me today is my cohort in crime, Shane Lang, who is a virtual Chief Information Security Officer with Convergence and master of all things compliance and cybersecurity. We work together with our clients to give a strategy and a look into cybersecurity. We work for Convergence Networks. Convergence has been around for about 25 years. We have over 200 IT professionals in the US and Canada, and we help about 400 plus companies with their IT strategy, managed services, business strategy, cybersecurity, and advisory services in IT. We're going to talk about a few topics today, and hopefully leaving this, you're going to have a much better idea of cybersecurity, get some of your questions answered. And we're going to start with the basics. We're going to move on to foundational cyber controls. We're going to talk a little bit deeper into common cybersecurity threats, some of the ones we're seeing most prevalently today. We're going to go into a few case studies to use some of those examples to give you a little bit deeper information on what you can do and what have happened in other organizations that you can prevent. And then Shane's going to finish up with a little cyber hygiene, things that you can do today to ensure that you're keeping your doorstep clean, your doors locked, your windows shut, to keep the bad guys out. And we'll finish up today with a little bit of question and answer. And hopefully get all of those, anything we don't cover in the material, answer for you, so you feel like you've got something out of this seminar. So super excited to get started. I'm going to pass it to Shane to talk a little bit about the SCIA triangle and model.
Thanks, Jeremy. Great introduction. Appreciate it. So in 2024, the average cost of a data breach within the United States reached $9.36 million, and $6.32 million in Canada, with 70% of businesses experiencing a business disruption from a cybersecurity incident. Obviously, underscoring the importance of cybersecurity for modern businesses. So when we talk about cybersecurity, specifically, we're talking about the protection of electronic assets like your networks, your computer systems, and of course your data from attacks that aim to disrupt, steal, or alter those assets. So by implementing appropriate safeguards that are well balanced across the key pillars of cybersecurity, you'll reduce your overall risk and make your business more resilient against attack. To highlight an example of impact to those pillars, a ransomware attack is a good example of that, as it often impacts all three key pillars. So, for example, the theft of data, meaning that it impacts the confidentiality of that data. It can corrupt files, meaning that there's an impact to the integrity of that data. And it, as we all know, it can encrypt or lock businesses out of their systems and their data. So, meaning there's an impact to the availability of that data. So if you want to build a strong security program that supports those key pillars, rather than taking a random cherry-picking approach that can leave you with gaps, a more effective way to manage your cybersecurity risks is by using recognized frameworks, which are proven blueprints for establishing security best practices. Popular frameworks include those from NIST, CIS is another, ISO, we're familiar with ISO, or compliance frameworks, for example, like CMMC for defense contractors, and HIPAA is another for those in healthcare. So these are just like building a house with a blueprint. A cybersecurity framework provides a structured plan to develop a comprehensive security program over time. So with that said, let's take a look at some of the foundational cybersecurity controls that come out of those frameworks. Okay, so asset management, not the most exciting topic in the world, of course, but we're talking about cybersecurity, one of the most critical. You can't secure what you don't know exists, right? So NIST and CIS frameworks prioritize this with identify all your hardware, identify all your software, including your cloud services. Many breaches happen simply because organizations lose track of their assets. If it's unknown, then it's very possible that it's unsecured, right? So, and that's when things can go sideways. Least privilege and access control. So limiting access to only what's necessary. If an attacker gets in, then their damage potential is going to depend on what they can reach. So least privilege, where employees only have the minimum access needed to do their jobs. And also important is that you're performing regular access reviews. Roles change within an organization, people move around, outdated or overprivileged permissions will create risk. So it's important that you're doing your regular access reviews as well. So tight access control will better protect your employees, your data, and the business. Backups and recovery testing. So everybody knows you need to be backing up your stuff, right? But backups are useless if they fail or they're unavailable when you need them. So testing your recovery regularly, can you actually restore your critical data? You need to know that. Establishing immutable backups, meaning that files for your backups can't be altered. This is essential for protection against ransomware situations. You can set retention periods, for example, like 7 days of immutability to prevent tampering for those backup sets. Your backups really are your last line of defense, so you want to make sure that they're working. Mobile device management. Smartphones are literally everywhere. Everyone's got one in their pocket. Without some kind of mechanism like mobile device management, it's going to present security risks. MDM can enforce controls like secure access, encryption, requiring specific apps to be used when you're accessing company data, for example, and also remote wipe capabilities if that device is lost or stolen. So a balance can also be established for personal devices like BYOD that jointly protects company data without sacrificing personal privacy. So if employees use these devices for work, then they need to be appropriately secured. Vulnerability management. So exploitation of known vulnerabilities has tripled over this last 12-month period. Regular patching really is a must in today's modern business environment. So especially for critical and exploitable vulnerabilities. Recurring vulnerability scans and penetration testing is going to inform you of your weaknesses before attackers can leverage them. You want to make sure that you have solid processes in place for identifying, tracking, and fixing your vulnerabilities in a timely fashion. And then lastly, we've got written policies and procedures. So policies function as organizational guardrails, right? So providing clear direction, boundaries, and consistency in your cybersecurity practices. So essential policies include security incident response. So you've got a good plan around what's going to happen if you get yourself into a cybersecurity incident. Access control, acceptable use is another important one. Set those expectations for your employees. Your backup and recovery, of course, which we just talked about. And very importantly is the security awareness training piece, right? Making sure that you're educating people on common threats and what to look out for. So think of written policies as the cybersecurity guardrails for your business. They help keep everybody on the right path. It reduces risk and ensures consistency in protecting those critical data assets.
Absolutely,
Okay.
Shane. One other thing just to add to that from an IT strategy point of view, this is all very holistic, right? It all works together. So having policies on, for example, your asset management allows you to ensure that their vulnerability management is taken, they're patched, and that they're backed up, right? As you said earlier, if you don't know that they're there, it's hard to do that. And it starts with a policy. And looking at IT overall, all of these controls work together.
100% agree with that, Jeremy. Okay. So our common cyber threats. We can take a look at some of these common cyber threats. I'm not going to dive into all of these today. We don't have enough time for that, but I want to highlight um, the current landscape here around threats, how attacks are happening, and why cybersecurity safeguards matter around these things. So social engineering and business email compromise, I think most of us are familiar with that. But what we're looking at here is social engineering attacks in all its various flavors, phishing, smishing, vishing, for example, are more targeted than ever, and they're tricking people into revealing credentials and downloading malware. 75% of breaches are involving human error, so the humans are involved in this equation, right? Business email compromise, where attackers are hijacking business email accounts to conduct fraud and redirect wire transfers and steal funds. The median loss per attack last year was about $50,000 US. Ransomware and cyber extortion, these things go hand in hand. When you look at across the top 5 here, they're closely linked. With ransomware attacks having surged about 300% over this last year, increasingly targeting small to mid-sized businesses, often because they're more vulnerable. Attackers are often using double extortion techniques where they're encrypting data, but then of course we're seeing the threats to leak stolen data as well to get that ransom. Credential stuffing. So what we're talking about here is attackers exploiting password reuse by testing stolen credentials obtained out from the dark web many times across various sites and services, often with automated tools. So the massive Power School breach that happened just this month is yet another example of stolen credentials being used with no multi-factor authentication requirement. Unpatched software, 180% increase in attacks exploiting unpatched systems. The bad guys are moving really fast when they find these things. It's particularly if they are zero-day vulnerabilities. So they're finding these things and acting on them very quickly. And we'll go over some of this stuff in a little bit more detail in some of the upcoming case studies. The perimeter and brute forces, again, this is another big one. So these continue to be top targets for attackers brute forcing weak credentials, a lot of times on remote access gateways and VPNs, lack of multi-factor authentication, exploitation of unpatched remote access systems. That we keep seeing this common theme in a lot of the breaches and security incidents that are making their way into the media. And a lot of it's relatively easily addressed through best practices. So something else I want to mention quickly here before we move on into some case studies is IoT vulnerabilities. So smart devices, they're lacking a lot of the security controls that they really need. A lot of times they're unpatched. They don't have the default credentials changed. There is some light at the end of the tunnel around this stuff, is that the Federal Communications Commission is currently developing a Cyber Trust Mark program for consumer IoT devices that will have a label that indicates that they're meeting NIST-based security standards for IoT. So that's coming. But in the meantime, you want to be sure that you're patching and changing those default credentials on those kind of IoT devices because they are being actively targeted. Also, your remote workers, people working from home, make sure you're getting the devices you're managing, your Wi-Fi routers updated, changing those default credentials. Same thing applies here. Last point here is generative AI. This is what I would consider to be an emerging threat. AI-powered phishing and deep fakes are making social engineering more effective. And also with the proliferation of generative AI types of tools, there's a lot of those kinds of technologies out there that people are jumping on. They're using them within the organization. A lot of times, they're unsanctioned AI tools, and that can lead to data leaks and compliance risks. So you want to be considering establishing a structure around policy for permitted generative AI tools within the company. So all that said, Jeremy, let's jump into some of the case study related to all of these threats.
Sounds good. We're going to talk about 3 case studies here, and they happened recently within the last year. We wanted to kind of keep something that was relevant and recent. One of the things to understand going into this is that there's really a spectrum of different bad actors out there that could potentially try to get into your system. Everywhere from the young kid in their parents' basement just trying to see if they can get in, to the far side, which is state actors that are breaking into major corporations for cyber espionage and those type of things. In the middle is the cyber criminals, and that's where we're going to really focus most of these conversations around, and including hacking groups. Not just an individual criminal, but an entire group that's funded and has resources to be able to do this. So we'll start with Snowflake data breach. If you're not familiar with the organization Snowflake, it's a company out of Bozeman, Montana. They are focused on cloud-based storage of data and data analytics. They also do some AI. They're a pretty large company if you have data analytics. Lots of major Fortune 500 and 1,000 companies use them. And in April 2024, people were able to get in there because they had hacked into, they had access to some of these client accounts. And that happens a lot of times with dark web information. They reach out, they find credentials that have been already compromised, and they use that to get into the incidences. And they from there, they start exfiltrating data. And at some point, they have a bunch of data that on clients. Then they start extorting it. They put it up for ransom. And Bitcoin is the key there. They use that. That's a mechanism that most of these bad actors use to actually get away with ransoming these type of things. The other major impact on this, and I think this is the key point on this one. Even though this company was relatively small in the grand scheme of things, it had some very, very large customers. AT&T, Ticketmaster, Neiman Marcus, they all use their services and therefore were victims of this compromise. Shane, can you give us a little bit more on that? Some takeaways from this event?
Yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. So some learning lessons from this situation. And again, if you think about the threats that I just kind of went over, you'll see tiebacks to that stuff as we go through the case studies. There's recurring themes. So, what do we know about these attacks? They weren't caused by a vulnerability or a breach of Snowflake systems. The threat actors, they simply used valid stolen credentials to gain access to the platform within customer accounts. So what does that tell you? All these impacted companies that were using Snowflake's cloud-based services were not following basic security protocols. And that can be a little bit surprising because we're talking about large companies here, right? And there's sort of an impression that they're doing security well, but it just points to the fact that this can happen to anybody. So multi-factor authentication was not enabled, meaning that successful authentication to a system that contains sensitive information, it only required a valid username and a password to get in there. Credentials that had been previously stolen from past malware infections were never changed. They were dumped out to the web, but they were still valid. Obviously a problem. The impacted Snowflake customer instances didn't have any network allow lists in place to limit access to that platform from trusted locations, as an example. And on the flip side of that, the vendor, the organization that's providing the service in the first place, Snowflake, they weren't making it a requirement for those customers to have MFA enabled in the first place. They left it up to the customer to turn that on, and they never did that in a lot of cases. So there's a lot of learning lessons here around, protecting your credentials, rotating credentials if there's a potential that they've been stolen, using these multi-factor authentication capabilities that are there for you, and doing some due diligence around your vendors as well, in terms of what are they doing to secure the environments that you're putting your sensitive data in. So a lot of good takeaways out of this particular case study.
Yeah, great. So the next one that we have is involved a Latin America regional airline. They again had stolen credentials. So in some cases, and this is probably most common, we'll hit this a couple of times, but users tend to recycle passwords. And so if you have a password that's compromised somewhere else, and that account exists with, say, an email address, those things can be used over and over again. And hackers will continue to use those to try to see if they can access systems. In this particular case, they were able to gain access to the network and, pull data, delete backups, which is all of our worst nightmares. As Shane said, backups are your last bastion. And that's the point that, if they can get in there and do that, then you're very vulnerable to their encryptions and ransomware, and being able to, hold your data hostage for money at that point. No backups means that, and people locked out means that that sensitive data is in the hands of the bad actors, and they are forcing companies into negotiations. And I want to point out before I hand this back over to Shane for lessons learned is in December, there was also an airline, a Japan airline was actually hacked as well. And we don't even know all the details of that one, but it's happening. And the key there is if it happens in one industry or with your competitors, if your competitors have been hacked, there's a good chance that they're coming after you, because these bad actors tend to if they figured out a way to get into one organization through social engineering or a methodology, they're going to try to use that over and over again. So Shane, you want to talk about more details on this one and how we can prevent it, how it could have been prevented?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, what are some of the things that we can learn from this particular situation with the airline ransomware attack? Recurring themes: user accounts intended for remote access and file transfers. So, ports and services exposed to the public internet, they weren't adequately secure. They didn't have multi-factor authentication. These open ports that are accessible from the internet weren't properly isolated as well, right, from the internal network. That's a problem. An exploitable, unmitigated vulnerability that was residing on an internal critical server, that really opened the door in this case for the attackers to be able to escalate their level of access to that of an administrator, and then allowing them to do more damage essentially at that point. So lack of network segmentation. So, breaking a larger network down into smaller, buckets, so to speak, that allowed the threat actors to move around and to move laterally within the network. Lack of continuous monitoring tools like MDR. So, that has allowed the attackers to make changes in the environment without tripping any alarms to IT, for example. And also lack of data loss prevention tools, allowing the exfiltration of data from the environment. So again, without any limitations or triggering of alerts to those who might be able to do something about it. And lastly is the implementation of immutable backups, like I mentioned earlier. So meaning backups that can't be modified, providing protection against threat actors attempting to destroy company data backups, which is what happened in this case with the backups being basically wiped out. So all important learning lessons and some things to think about, takeaways from this particular situation.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that I'd add to that is just that, if you think about your own accounts, if you're using your business password somewhere else on a different platform, then it means that there's just more of an attack surface for the bad guys, because if they don't have to compromise your business account, they compromise another account that's associated with your email, and all of a sudden they may have your password in there. And if there's not MFA in place, then that really leaves you vulnerable to that. So use unique passwords. We'll get to that in a bit, but for sure. And lastly, we're going to talk about Las Vegas casino attacks. And again, you might have seen this in the news. There were two kind of in a row. The first one was the MGM Regional International Network. Again, once again, ransomware and exfiltrated data for ransom. So, and they did this though a little differently. It wasn't stolen credentials, although that may have started it. But it was really implemented by a social engineering attack. They got someone to click on something. They got someone to allow them into their system through social engineering, which is another big major issue as we see that out there. And then about a month later or so, there was a similar attack on Caesars. And again, going back to that earlier comment, I said if they're doing it to one industry or one group, they're probably trying the other ones because they've got a way in that they can reuse over and over again and recycle. The implementation or the impact of this whole thing was, there's 10 days of outage. $100 million is the estimated financial hit. That's probably not including all of the reputational hit and everything else that they took. And then Caesars paid another 15 million for theirs. So, both of them exposed customer data information. And I think that's a big hit because now they can use that information to do other things. So, this thing, it tends to cascade. And Shane's going to explain some more of how this could have been prevented. You're going to hear some common themes, I think, in this, this process.
Yeah. So this casino attacks was interesting because they use social engineering methods to and a little bit of pre reconnaissance, if you will, looking at LinkedIn profiles for some of the leadership level people at MGM. So they did a little bit of research, found their quote unquote victims through doing that research on LinkedIn to find suitable candidates, gather information about those individuals that they put out there publicly on their LinkedIn profiles, and use that information to socially engineer the IT help desk to ultimately give them access to that person's account. So, some things around, again, what can we learn from this? Being careful about what personal information you're sharing on social media platforms. People often unknowingly give away personal information that can help a threat actor answer a security question associated to their account. Social engineering, as we've seen, can overcome poor help desk policies. So conducting recurring risk assessments can help identify weak areas, not only in technical systems, but in human process and procedures, like sharing one-time passcodes over the phone or electronically, those kinds of things, identifying some weaker areas and making adjustments. Having a security incident response plan, I talked about this a little bit earlier. That plan is really critical for every business. And in that plan, you want to be identifying, who the key stakeholders are, what the escalation paths are, the contact information of who you need to reach when you need to reach them, what the communication flow looks like. Having all these things outlined in your incident response plan before you run into a situation is going to make a massive positive impact in these situations. So employee security awareness training, and I talked about that a little bit earlier as well, and requiring that of your third-party contractors. Maybe you put that down in your contracts when you're looking at establishing contracts with vendors and business partners. That can help prevent breaches, as human error often plays a role, right? We see this over and over. So while multi-factor authentication is important, and we're talking about that a lot today, it's not foolproof. Okay, it's not a silver bullet. There is stronger phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication out there. For example, like MFA with number matching in your authenticator app. For example, we're using hardware keys or biometrics to help strengthen your authentication. Also, restricting the ability for lateral movement, as we mentioned in the previous case study, through stricter access controls and network segmentation. Those things can halt or at least slow down an attacker if they're trying to get into the environment and then move laterally to other resources. So in this case, it would have impeded the attackers moving between the infrastructure within this environment. So Jeremy mentioned for MGM like a $100 million impact from this breach. Just this week, as a final note around this topic, is MGM is settling the multi-class action lawsuit that's associated to this particular incident for a tune of $45 million. So 100 around the breach, $45 million related to lawsuits. That's a costly endeavor.
Yes, for sure. Starts becoming real money at that point, right?
Yeah.
So, and then I think we're moving on to the next section. Great. Shane, can you talk to us a little bit about, some good cyber hygiene that everybody can do to prevent this type of events?
So, the points on this slide shouldn't be news to anybody really, but again, a lot of times they get overlooked or they're forgotten about for various reasons. So, strong, unique passwords. As Jeremy has mentioned before today, password reuse is a problem. So, the emphasis on using unique passwords across your various accounts is really important. If that password is getting compromised, it's only going to potentially impact one account, not 10 accounts, right? The bad guys are looking for that, and they're using those credential stuffing techniques to reapply credentials across multiple services. Using phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication, like I just talked about, is going to help you, get away from your SMS-based, text codes that you're getting, or your callbacks, or your security-related questions. Those types of weaker forms of multi-factor authentication just need to go away. Password managers, they are your friend. If you have one, make sure you're using it, of course. I think, in my opinion, the use of password managers will help reduce your overall risk compared to usually what happens if you're not using that, which leads to a lot of times bad practices in terms of writing down passwords or storing them in places that are not secure and making it easier for the bad guys to find those things. So they've also set you up well with being able to create those strong passwords, those lengthy passwords that you just can't remember, to strengthen the security of those accounts. So that's an important one. Again, if you think back to that list of the threats that we looked at, unpatched software, I think, if I remember correctly, was number 4 on the list. And again, we keep seeing that. We saw that with one of the case studies here, where they were able to get inside the environment and take advantage of a system that hadn't been patched in a timely fashion. So making sure that these things are getting updated. This goes to, applies to your devices at home as well. Like I said, your IoT devices, your personal devices, your Wi-Fi router, these things, where you're bringing your work device into the environment and connecting to these devices. It's really important that everything is being updated on a regular basis.
My stove and my refrigerator are IoT devices, Jane, so I get that.
Yeah. Public Wi-Fi, this is, everybody needs to get connected to the internet in the various places that we travel to, but just know that there's risk around using public Wi-Fi, right? There's risks around eavesdropping. You are in a public setting. There's nothing stopping a bad actor from connecting to that same network and trying to spy on you and extract information out of what you're doing there. So be cautious about, if you are going to use public Wi-Fi, just be careful about what kind of transactions you conduct over the web in those environments. And ideally try to limit those to other times when you're in a more secure environment. And charging stations too. The public charging stations can be easily compromised by threat actors, allowing them to get malware onto your system. So just avoid all of that and use your own charger. Reducing your attack surface. So this is just, again, mathematics. The fewer applications, the less software you have on your devices, then the fewer vulnerabilities you're going to have associated to patching them, right? You don't have to patch them as much because they're just not there. And that eliminates a lot of the opportunity and vulnerabilities that an attacker might be able to leverage. So, streamline your stuff, make sure you're doing your good maintenance around those things. And then lastly is the safe browsing habits, using secure connections like HTTPS. That padlock icon in your browser is telling you if your web session is using encryption or not. So be cautious, again, what kind of information you're sharing over unencrypted sessions. Using well-respected ad pop-up blockers, those kinds of things. We've all been browsing the web for a long time, a lot of us, and we're familiar with ad pop-up blockers, but sometimes we're not using them. So they do help you. So take advantage of those things. Avoiding clicking on sidebar search ads. There's a lot of malicious injections that are going into adverts that are sticking out in the sidebar. So you want to avoid clicking on those things. Try to go directly to the source if you can, if you know where you're going. And again, recurring theme here, keep your browser and your plugins updated. Those things, there's vulnerabilities, zero-day vulnerabilities popping up in these things all the time. So it's important to make sure that you're, particularly on your personal devices as well, getting updated regularly. There is a do not track option within your browsers for those who aren't aware about it, of that, and that can help protect your privacy if you turn that on. And, be cautious with your web downloads. So, go to your IT if you need something specific for an application for work, for example, or when you're at home, then just be sure that you're downloading files and software from reputable sources. Go directly to those sources, like I said, if you know where you're going. So lastly, try to avoid storing your passwords in your browser. I would say it's a better option than not using anything, but using a password manager, again, if that's something that's available to you or you're thinking about using that, personally, or if you have one available at work, that is built for purpose. And it has strong cryptography, and it's not relying upon your browser or your operating system. So it's generally, it will serve you better. So that's really it for the cyber hygiene items. So we can jump into some takeaways.
So Shane, can you talk a little bit about strong authentication, what that really means for the average user? What does that look like?
Yeah. So and we touched on this a little bit, but to clarify, so strong authentication, what we're talking about here is, and we saw this a little bit in the earlier slides around the threats, with credential theft being a top attack vector. Enabling phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication wherever you can is critical. So again, I'm talking about your biometrics or in addition to your password, right? So you've got a strong password, but you're also using something else like a biometric, or you're using number matching in your authenticator app. There's a number displayed on your screen when you're trying to log in, and you have to match that number into your authenticator app to authenticate. So those kinds of things are considered phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication, and it's more difficult for the threat actors to try to take advantage of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we saw that throughout the scenarios and those things. If that had been in place, I think a lot of those issues wouldn't have happened, right?
Exactly.
And then establishing the key policies, and I'll just jump in for a second here before I let you talk about that, Shane. But again, we see this as from an IT strategy point of view. This is very holistic. Having good policies and having written policies and planned policies is how you make sure that all of those things get done. If you're just If you're just doing it and letting it happen, letting devices get added to your network and without any kind of plan, you're going to be exposing yourself to risk.
Yeah, 100%. These policies, they establish a robust incident response plan, for example, right? We talked about that a little bit already. That's really important. Your backup and recovery testing, again, make sure that you've got that policy that supports those activities and that you're actually, following those procedures and doing your testing of those things on a regular cadence. Acceptable use, again, make it clear to your employees what is allowed, what's not allowed, set those things up early for them. It eliminates a lot of opportunity for things to go sideways if there's misunderstandings about what's expected. And your password policies, right? We've talked a lot about passwords today, credential management, those kinds of things. Outline that clearly in your policies. Require strong passwords to be created by your people, and that's going to help you, right? It establishes those necessary guardrails, the best practices, and your recovery capabilities.
And recurring assessments, how often should they be doing this? What does that look like for a best practice?
That's a good question. So generally, I would say you want to be doing a risk assessment across your organization on at least an annual basis, possibly more often if there's significant change within the environment, right? So let's say you do a whole rip and replace of your IT infrastructure. Probably want to do like a follow-up risk assessment to get a good picture of what that looks like, post implementation of those things. But generally, and you see this in the compliance frameworks, is at least an annual risk assessment around, understanding where your gaps are in your environment.
And then asset management and vulnerability management. I think we beat this one up a little bit, but how important it is. I hope everybody walks away with the fact that, if you don't know it's there, you can't secure it. And I think the other theme that I kept hearing from Shane's points was, you extending the network out to your home. You have lots of remote workers now. Use public Wi-Fi or without a VPN, which adds risk that may have their home network unsecured. They may have, video game consoles and TVs as IoT devices that are plugged into their network that could be compromised. So it really increases the attack surface, right, on that. And so making sure that all of that stuff is patched, right, Shane? That's the real takeaway there.
Yeah, you nailed it. I would say, and you said this already, is that you really need to know what you've got in your environment, right? Your hardware, your software, your cloud apps. And again, can't secure it if you don't know that it's there, right? So that's really important, and we see that over and over again where something changes in the environment, and people aren't aware of it, and it gets overlooked. So recurring vulnerability scans, penetration tests, that's going to help you identify your weaknesses in those assets before the bad guys do, right? It gives you that opportunity to see where they are, and then figure out a plan to address them. So.
And access control and review. I know we've talked about access control a little bit. The review part in from an IT strategy point of view, I think is really overlooked all the time and open security holes. I can't tell you how many times we've had clients that have told us, oh, that, we look at accounts that are on there that have administrative privileges, and they're like, well, that person hasn't worked here in 2 years. So we've essentially had an open account that has been available to the bad guys for 2 years, and it needs to be secured and removed. So what's your take on that, Shane?
Yeah, I see that as well. A lot of times, I think unless you've actually got that defined where you are doing that on a fixed frequency, you've got some kind of trigger mechanism, whether it's an Outlook reminder, whatever it is that you're doing this, like maybe it's every quarter, that kind of thing. what I see a lot of times is, people think that they're doing a pretty good job about it, but then when you start to really zoom in on it and look at that, they're like, oh, well, okay, yeah, that guy, like you said, he's been gone for 2 years. I only missed that one. There's things that pop up, right? So it's really important that that periodic review is happening to identify those things, because it really does, particularly, we're in situations where you've got accounts for people that have departed the organization, the account's still active. Maybe that malware gets into the system somewhere and that credential is dumped out to the web. We've seen the case studies, right? We know how that goes. So really important that that access control and the review of that is happening regularly.
And then on to training and testing. And we got some great questions we'll answer about training for sure. Just an overview, Shane, of training and testing. What do you think they need to take home from that today?
Yeah, so the security awareness training is really, really important, obviously. One of the reasons around that is that the the threats are continuously changing, right? The bad guys are always changing up what they're doing, and that ebbs and flows with the technologies because the technologies change, right? So it's important that your people are being trained on what those new trends are, what's changing, so that they're kind of a little bit more prepared and have an idea of what to look out for, right? So the security awareness training, really important. In terms of how often or frequency, that's, I would say, it depends a little bit on the culture within the organization, but generally you want to be doing it at least on a monthly basis, I would say, or maybe even weekly, depending again on the environment within the organization and what people's saturations points are for ingesting that kind of information. But it needs to be happening on a regular basis. There needs to be a way for someone within the organization, maybe it's human resources or whatever it may be, that can kind of monitor what the training is looking like for people, making sure that people are actually doing it, and following up if there's people that are maybe having a problem, for whatever reason. That whole environment around security awareness training is really important. It needs to be an area of focus.
Getting people in the mindset of security, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so let's move on. I think that's the end of our presentation. This is a good chance to do question and answer. I know we have a bunch of them in there that we'll try to get through all of those in the next few minutes. If we don't, we'll definitely follow up after this with some information, and you'll get a copy of the video, the recording. So we'll try to get these things answered as best we can. So, Shane, you want to start us out? The questions?
Yeah, sure. So looking at our questions we got here. So is using a password manager truly secure, given that it stores all my passwords in a single account? So that's a good question. Nothing is 100% secure. So let me say that first of all. I hit on this a little bit earlier around the use of a password manager. From what I've seen, I've been doing this stuff for a long time, and generally, and to say it too, Convergence does ethical hacking, white hat hacking, right? A lot of times, what we see is bad practices around passwords. People are, putting credentials into a document somewhere. They're storing them on their phone, or they're writing them down. There's a lot of risk around those practices, right? So in terms of using a password manager, no, they're not perfect, but generally, if you set them up properly and secure them in a good way, you're using a good, strong master password, you're enabling good multi-factor authentication like we've talked about on that account. That's going to go a long way to securing that information in a good way. It's encrypted, right? So in general, I would say the risks around using a password manager are considerably less than the practices that happen if you're not using a password manager, if that makes sense.
I agree 100%. And anything is better than password written down on a sticky note underneath your keyboard. That is not a secure method. And so, yes, password managers are far more secure than that. Okay. I'll start this one. How frequently should we schedule cybersecurity training for my employees? I think Shane just kind of addressed this, but the more often, the better is the answer, and to the tolerance of your organization. If you can do it weekly, that's optimal. It keeps it in people's minds. They're then aware of it. You make awareness is the real key to that. We like to say, weekly is good, monthly is okay, quarterly is minimal, right? Do it once a quarter. The organizations that do it once a year, your people will answer those questions. And I just saw the survey that we did. Some of those are rarely or never. That's not enough, right? Because those people aren't thinking about it, and that's when incidents happen. And you can almost see a correlation between how often those organizations have events and how often they are training. So, anything to add to that, Shane?
Yeah, no, I 100% support that. Like we said, um, general rule is, more frequently the better. There's a threshold there, of course, right? And use common sense. You don't want to hit people up every single day. They're just not going to do it. But um, it's important to get that current information in front of them, and that you're testing them on a recurring basis. And the other part of this too, just to add to it quickly, is that that organizations are doing phishing simulation campaigns, right? So that kind of goes hand in glove with the security awareness training. Like, you educate people what to look out for, and then you test them with the phishing simulation campaigns, right? That's an important part of that equation.
Absolutely. So the next one is, if my kids use the same Wi-Fi as I do, is that something that should be concerned about? Is there anything it can do to limit the risk? I will start with that one. We talked about this a little bit earlier, which is, on your home network, you probably have your TVs plugged in, you have your game consoles plugged in, your kids are using those, and they probably have their own computers and potentially downloading and getting risk. As I said, I have my stove and my refrigerator are plugged in for updates to my network, right? They need live internet feeds. All of that becomes a risk, a surface for your home. What I recommend to my clients who ask this question is create a separate Wi-Fi network, separate those two things so that you're using one for your business and one for your personal, if your router is capable of doing that at home. Some aren't. But if you can do that, that's one way to separate those things. The other thing is use a VPN. If you connect to your office and you use a VPN, you're more protected because your connection is encrypted. Anything to add to that, Shane?
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it, Jeremy. The VPN is going to give you encryption and confidentiality over that session that you're using, if you're using it for work or whatever. But yeah, the segmentation piece, if you're concerned about, I mean, your kids, they're not going to know necessarily, what some of the risks are in what they're doing, right? So you can kind of put some barriers around them and protect them from themselves, by moving those devices, as Jeremy said, into a separate little Wi-Fi network or bubble, so to speak. So they're a little bit protected in where they are with the devices that they're using. They have access to the web, but what they're doing is going to potentially negatively impact you if something went sideways in that environment.
Absolutely. And there's nothing wrong with training your kids. If you're doing training, share that with your family. It's always good. I mean, information is passed. If they're teenagers like mine, you'll still get eye rolls and you'll still get, whatever, but it's still, it's good to inform them as well about the risks and security.
Yeah, yeah.
Can an employee safely use my personal devices for work if they aren't managed under an MDM solution? Shane, I'll let you start with this one.
Oh, that's a good question. Safely use personal devices for work if they aren't managed. Yeah, maybe. Um, depends on your definition of safely, I guess, or your perspective on safely. So MDM, like I said earlier, it's going to ultimately it's going to protect the data for the organization, right? And it's also, if you set it up properly, it's going to also protect the personal information of the individual who's using their own personal device. So there's good ways of being able to do that through an MDM solution. If you're not using an MDM solution or a MAM, mobile application management solution for BYOD types of devices, it's significantly more difficult to secure those devices in a good way that's going to limit the impact on those devices if a bad guy gets into the environment. So you can secure it, but it's not the best option. Like I said, MDM is really particularly if you're running into situations where you might have compliance requirements to, adequately, appropriately protect information that's corporate. You really need to look at that to do that in a good way.
Yeah.
What would you say, Jeremy?
Yeah, no, it's one of those questions where it comes down to functionality versus security. So the benefit of having employees have their devices and having something on there is a spectrum of that. So some applications, business applications like Outlook, can still be managed without a full MDM solution. And so it really comes down to a risk conversation about what is the right level of functionality that I'm giving my employees without giving the organization too much security risk. And so that has to be kind of taken on a case-by-case basis. And again, having a guest network, for example, where those devices will connect if they're in your office, as opposed to connecting to the main network is important. And then just in general, again, policies, practices, and training so that your users are doing the right thing on that device and it's not compromising any of your business data or network. Those are some controls you can put in place. They're not perfect. My answer is use MDM everywhere you can if you're using it for business. But if you can't, then put all the other controls in place.
I agree.
So what steps should I take if an employee mistakenly clicks on a phishing email that seems legitimate? The first thing I'm going to say is don't unplug the computer. That's what everybody does. They immediately assume that it's compromised and they unplug it. If you're working with a partner like Convergence, we're going to want to remotely access that thing to make sure that it's working. So the first thing I recommend is report it. Talk to your IT partner, if you have internal IT, let them know. Get someone to look at it immediately to make sure that it's not compromised and it's not going to do anything else. Shane, any pieces of wisdom there?
You got a security incident response plan, right? So you know what to do. Yeah, so follow your incident response plan, right? Make sure you're notifying IT if again, as Jeremy says, if you're working with Convergence, we're going to help you through that. But if you have your own internal IT, make sure that they're aware of that situation as soon as possible so that they can investigate and make determinations around what needs to happen with that system and sort of next steps around that.
Okay. How does Convergence use analytics from network sensors, lessons learned, firewall logs to proactively assist clients with identifying persistent threats to their organization, hardening clients' assets, and minimizing attack surface of the client's systems?
Oh, that's a good question.
It is a good question. So Convergence specifically, we deploy a couple of layers of defense, right? Defense in depth type conversations. We're going to have an antivirus on the system. We're going on every endpoint. We're going to have MDR, managed detection and response systems that are watching for unusual events that are happening. We have the ability to do what they call SIM or SIEM, which allows us to actually look at logs and those type of things if it's determined that's needed in the network. And then, we've got a 24-hour security operations center that is watching. We've got a network operations center, which is also watching equipment offline and those type of things that could be a prerequisite to an attack or an event. So we're looking at those things continuously. If you're not doing that, if you don't have partners that do all of that, then I suggest you look for it. Look, because the problem with a lot of these issues that we saw in the examples is there was probably what we call dwell time, which is the bad guys were in the systems for a while, and they were looking, that's how they get the ransomware deployed. Although, as Shane said, they're working a lot faster these days. Sometimes they sit in there for months and watch things like with business email compromise and those type of things. And so having monitoring, having someone looking at that is much more likely you're going to identify the issues before they actually become an issue, right? There may be somebody in there, but they're not doing anything bad at this point. But if we can identify that, you can remediate the issue, get rid of them, and then you don't have a problem at that point. So anything else, Shane, to that?
Well said. I would just add to that in terms of how does Convergence use that information, Convergence is continually evolving, right? We look at the things that we're using, the tools that we make available to our clients. We analyze, how can we make those things better? What are the trends that we're seeing based on, the current threat environments? What can we do to make things better for our customers? We're continuously looking at those things and making adjustments to the things that we make available to our clients. So, we're also looking at changing process and procedure, establishing baselines for how we do certain things to secure devices in a consistent manner. So that's always, evolution that we're going through, and it changes over time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks for this, Shane and Jeremy. I actually think my thermostat at my home, my locking system would be considered IoT devices. That's correct. What steps should I take to ensure those devices don't pose a risk to my network? Is there a best practice to look at security flaws? Great question. And I will tell you that the way I do it is I separate my network. I have all of those IoT devices as well, including Ring cameras, including a bunch of different things at home. I love the convenience of them, but I separate them in a network. So my firewall has two different networks. There's a home network that I use for me and my family. I have a network that I use for those IoT devices. So they're always considered separate from there. And then I make sure I have something on my calendar to remind me to go through and update those on a regular basis. For example, the Ring cameras should be automatically updating, but you still got to check. Sometimes they fail. Make sure you're doing that. Make sure that those things are being updated. Vulnerability management, as Shane has brought up a couple of times, that's a big piece. And then the other thing, and this is the way we would still separate it for a business network, right? Those things need to be separated from the rest of your network to ensure protection.
Yeah, I agree.
If using a VPN on a phone, is public Wi-Fi still risky? Shane, what do you think of
that? Short answer, yes, still risky, not as risky. There's still, it doesn't prevent you from being spied on if somebody's in that same network, right? You're using the VPN and there's encryption being applied when you're using that VPN session, but a threat actor on the environment, if he's got the right tool sets, he can still probe your computer and look for things. So yeah, a little bit better, but still some risk associated to it.
I agree. Yeah. I know my colleague stored a bunch of passwords with Google. Can Convergence advise on how to change that? She is not all that tech savvy. So I would say that most of those things, if you're with Google or if you have a different type of password manager, and I'm assuming you're saying Google Cloud or Google Chrome, you can export those as a text file, and then you can import them into an actual password manager that is usually there. There's plenty of good YouTube videos on how to do that. I would start there. Again, when, just a word of caution, when you export those as text, they are wide open. So you want to make sure you hard delete that file at the end, to make sure that it's not just sitting out there on your computer, because that gives you a risk of all those passwords being exposed. So anything you want to add to that, Shade?
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. I think that's a good solid answer, Jeremy.
And again, the better way without having to put that risk is just to type them into a new password manager. That's probably the most secure.
Mhm. Right.
And then the last question here is, sometimes cybersecurity controls make things too complicated for a small company. Say you use a VPN on an employee's PCs. What are the top 5 measures you would recommend?
Mm. Yeah, so frankly, I think we covered those today. VPN, yeah, VPNs is a good tool. It's going to help, give you that confidentiality over the session that you're having. It's going to protect you a little bit. As I said, make sure you're using strong authentication for your systems, right? We talked about that. Get your policies in place. That doesn't necessarily have to be overly complicated. Put the guardrails in place like we talked about, right? Do your
MFA.
assessments, right? Some kind of an assessment on a regular basis so you understand what your risks are in your environment. And really important, the asset management piece of this, right? So know what you've got in your environment, like we talked about. That's one of the biggest ones, frankly. And then, get a good visibility around the vulnerabilities associated to your assets, right? That's just basic care and feeding of your environment. Any business can do that, no matter the size. The access control, again, same thing there. Make sure that, people don't need to be running around with, local admin access while they're browsing the web necessarily, or checking their email, right? So malware is going to take advantage of those kinds of levels of privileges if you're doing that. So, control your access, do your access reviews, do your training and testing. All of these basic foundational concepts will go a long way without having to be overly technical.
Yeah. And make sure you have MFA on everything you can. That's one big, and we saw from the examples, that's a way to get in companies large and small, protecting that, and knowing that our banks and every other organization is kind of pushing towards MFA. Your users will get used to doing it. They may complain. That's what we hear the most in small businesses, but it's happening everywhere in the world. So they shouldn't be surprised when it happens at their work as well.
Well said.
All right. Well, I think that ties everything up. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As I said, we're going to send out some information after this. Thank you, Shane, for your big brain and amazing knowledge there. We look forward to seeing you guys all on a new call. Maybe we'll do one of these in the near future. So thank you.
Awesome.
Have a
Yeah,
great
thank
day.
you, everybody. Appreciate
Bye.
it. Have a good day. Bye-bye.